The coffee had gone cold before I even took a second sip. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that Thursday morning, the kind of gray November morning where the light never really comes up all the way, just sits there dull and flat through the window. My wife had been gone 14 months. The house still smelled like her sometimes, early in the morning before I'd opened anything up. I'd learned not to say that out loud to people, because they'd look at me the way people look at you when they don't know what to say. I wasn't going to the bank for anything important. I needed $400 cash for the guy who was coming to clean out the gutters. He didn't take cards. I'd been meaning to call him since September, and the leaves were already coming down hard, so I finally just booked it and figured I'd run by the branch on Millbrook on my way back from picking up my prescription. That's how ordinary the day was supposed to be. The branch wasn't busy, a Tuesday level quiet for a Thursday. One teller open, a young woman with her hair pulled back, and she smiled when I walked up and asked how I was doing. I said fine. I slid over my withdrawal slip and my ID. She typed for a moment, then she stopped. She typed again, looked at the screen, then she looked at me in a way that was different from the first look. Not the customer service smile anymore. Something else behind her eyes. She leaned forward, just slightly, and lowered her voice. "Sir," she said, "before I process this, would you mind stepping over to speak with our branch manager? There's something on your account I think you should be aware of." I almost laughed. I thought maybe there was a hold, or I'd forgotten about some fee, or something like that. I said sure. She picked up her phone and made a quiet call, and within 2 minutes a man in his 40s with a blue tie came out from the back and shook my hand and walked me to a small office off to the side. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the desk and said, "Mr. Hale, I want to show you something, and I want you to look carefully." He turned the monitor toward me. My checking account, the one my wife and I had shared for 31 years, the one that, after we sold the lake house in Wisconsin following her diagnosis, after the insurance payout, after every careful decision we'd made for 3 decades, should have held just over $220,000. The balance was $11,412. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at the number. Then I looked at the list of withdrawals he scrolled up on the screen. $12, $15, $18,000. Dates going back almost 2 years. Dozens of transactions, all of them authorized, all of them made by the second name on the account. My son. His name is Owen. He's 42 years old. He lives about 20 minutes from me, in the same suburb where he grew up, which I used to think was a sign of how close we were. He's got 2 kids, a girl and a boy, 8 and 10 now, and a wife named Patrice, who I've always liked and who I think knew less than she should have about what her husband was doing. When my wife got sick, the diagnosis came in March of 2022, pancreatic, stage 3. Owen stepped up in a way that made me proud. He came to appointments. He took notes when the doctors were explaining things I couldn't absorb. He handled the calls to the insurance company when I just didn't have it in me. I'm not a man who asks for help easily. 58 years old, retired electrician, spent my whole life handling things myself. But there's a version of fear that strips that out of you. Watching your wife disappear in slow motion will do that. Owen suggested, about 6 months in, that he be added to our checking account. Just in case, he said. If something happened and I needed him to make a payment or handle something quickly, it would be easier. He said it quietly, gently, the way you say things to someone you're trying to spare. I said yes without thinking twice. My daughter Renata had offered to help too. She lives in Phoenix. She's an occupational therapist, 2 hours behind us, busy in a way that made me feel guilty, asking her for anything. She flew in 3 times during her mother's illness. She sat with her. She cried in the hallway where she thought no one could see her. She didn't ask to be on the account. She just showed up when she could and went back to her life when she had to, and I think I held that against her in a way I'm ashamed of now. She wasn't there every week like Owen was. I saw that as a kind of choosing. My wife passed in January of 2023. Owen handled the funeral home. He handled the paperwork with the county. He helped me go through her clothes, which is the kind of thing you can't pay someone to do. I would have given him anything in those months. I think he knew that. The branch manager let me sit in that office as long as I needed. He had a box of tissues on the desk, the kind of detail that told me this wasn't the first time he'd had this particular conversation. He explained that as a joint account holder, Owen had full legal access to the funds. He could withdraw, transfer, close, legally. The bank had processed every transaction according to the account terms. Then he said something that I've thought about almost every day since. "We're not able to take action on our end," he said, "but I'd strongly encourage you to speak to an attorney before you make any calls home. Don't let whoever it is know you've been here." I nodded. I don't know if I said thank you. I think I just stood up and walked back out through the lobby and sat in my car in the parking lot for 45 minutes. The gutter guy never got his $400 that day. I canceled by text and said something came up. He said no problem. Normal people stuff. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a name. I've heard people talk about betrayal, about shock, about the stages of whatever. But this was different from any of that. This was the feeling of realizing that someone had sat at my kitchen table, eaten my food, held my hand at my wife's graveside, and been stealing from me the entire time. Not before she died, during and after. I went home and I sat in the same chair where the coffee had gone cold that morning, and I thought about every conversation I'd had with Owen in the past 2 years. Every time he'd said he was worried about me. Every time he'd suggested I slow down on spending, that I think carefully about the future, that I didn't need to send money to his sister for her birthday, or spend what I was spending on keeping up the house. I'd thought he was being responsible. I thought he was looking after me. He was tracking the balance, making sure I didn't notice. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle the way old houses do, and I thought about my wife. We'd built that money slowly. She taught 4th grade for 27 years. I worked union jobs, took the overtime when it came, said no to things we could have said yes to so that someday we wouldn't have to say no. The lake house had been her idea, a small place we'd rented for years before we finally bought it. We sold it because the medical bills made that the smart thing to do. She cried the day we signed those papers. Not in front of me. I heard her in the bathroom afterward. That money was her. Part of it was her. I thought about Renata. About 8 months after the funeral, Owen had mentioned offhand that he thought Renata hadn't been handling the estate questions well, that she'd been difficult when he was trying to coordinate things. He'd said it casually, like he was just keeping me informed, but I'd stored it somewhere in the back of my mind and let it color the way I talked to her. A small frost that had settled in without me realizing. She'd called me the previous spring, concerned about something she'd noticed. She'd asked me how things were going financially, whether I was comfortable, whether I was okay. I'd brushed her off. I'd said everything was fine. She'd pushed gently, and I'd gotten a little short with her, and she'd backed off in the way she always did, when she sensed she was making me uncomfortable. I'd told Owen about the call later, casually, over lunch, and he'd shaken his head and said something about how Renata always worried too much, always wanted to be involved in things that weren't her business. I had believed him. I lay in the dark and understood that he had been managing me, that every conversation, every small comment, every gentle steering had been designed to keep me calm and keep me away from the accounts and keep me from listening to the one person who had actually been paying attention. I called an attorney the next morning. I'd gotten the name from my neighbor, a retired school teacher named Ed, who had been through a guardianship dispute with his own family a few years back. The attorney's name was Faye Hollister. She had an office downtown, 3rd floor of an old building on Clement Street, the kind of office with actual books on the shelves and a window that looked out over the street below. She listened to everything without interrupting. She took notes in a yellow legal pad. When I was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she told me what I was looking at. The account had been joint with right of survivorship. Owen's access was entirely legal, while the account was structured that way. But the civil case wasn't necessarily unwinnable. If I could demonstrate that Owen had used undue influence to gain access to the account during a period of my documented vulnerability, the illness, the death, the grief, a civil attorney could potentially pursue a claim. She recommended I also contact the State Attorney General's Elder Financial Abuse Hotline, because depending on the circumstances, what Owen had done could rise to the level of criminal exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She said that last phrase carefully, like she was aware of how hard it lands. I asked her what I should do right now, today. She said, remove him from the account, change every password, don't confront him yet, document everything. I went back to the branch that afternoon. The manager from the day before helped me personally. Owen was removed from the account. I opened a new individual checking account and transferred the remaining balance. I went home and changed the password on my email, my phone carrier account, my utilities portal, my investment account. Everything Owen had offered to help me set up over the past 2 years, which I now understood had been its own kind of access. 3 days later, Renata called. She sounded careful, like she was bracing for me to be distant. I said, "I owe you an apology, a real one. Can you come here?" She was on a plane 2 days later. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and I told her everything. I watched her face go through 6 different things while I talked. At the end, she was very still and very quiet, and then she said, "Dad, I tried to tell you." She had. She'd noticed the change in me, the way I'd pulled back from her. She'd noticed that whenever she and Owen were in the same room, he had a way of positioning himself between us, literally and figuratively, answering for me, speaking before I could. She hadn't been able to name it exactly, but she'd felt it. She told me about a holiday dinner, 2 Christmases ago, when she'd mentioned to Owen privately that she thought I seemed confused about some of the financial details of the estate. He'd dismissed her. He'd said I was fine, just grieving, that she didn't need to worry, that he was handling it. She'd let it go. She'd told herself she was projecting, that she felt guilty for not being closer, that maybe she was seeing problems because she wanted to feel useful. She'd been right the whole time. I'd spent almost 2 years letting my son quietly position the loyal one as the troublemaker. Faye Hollister filed the civil complaint 6 weeks after my first meeting with her. She documented the pattern of withdrawal, the timeline relative to my wife's death, the undue influence argument built on medical records, account statements, and a witness statement from my neighbor Ed, who had seen Owen's behavior at the house in the months after the funeral. The state attorney general's office opened a separate inquiry. Elder financial exploitation in the state is a Class 3 felony if the amount exceeds a certain threshold. The amount in my case exceeded it by a significant margin. Owen called me the evening after he was served. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times. I did not call back. Faye had advised me not to communicate with him directly, and I was finding it easier than I expected to follow that advice. I got a text later that night that said, "Dad, I can explain. There were expenses you don't know about. I needed help and I didn't know how to ask. Please call me." I read it twice. I put my phone face down on the counter and went to bed. Patrice reached out to Renata, not to me. She was shaken. She said she hadn't known the extent of it, that she'd known Owen had used some of my money for a business investment that went bad, but that she'd believed it was a loan I'd agreed to. She sounded genuinely devastated. I don't fully know what to believe about how much she knew. I think about her kids, my grandchildren, who I haven't seen since before any of this came to light, and I feel something that doesn't resolve cleanly. That's the part nobody tells you about. People talk about the villain getting what they deserve, and there's a version of that coming. I believe it is. But there are people attached to the villain who didn't choose to be part of this, and you have to figure out how to hold that. I don't have a clean answer. I'm still working on it. What I do have is Renata. She flew back to Phoenix 3 weeks after her visit, but we talk now. Every couple of days. Real conversations, not the careful, slightly distant ones we'd been having. She sends me pictures of her dog, a big, goofy lab mix named Biscuit, who she adopted last year. She's been asking about coming back for Thanksgiving. Not just a flight-in, flight-out visit, but a real stay. She wants to bring her friend Cecile, who she's been seeing for a couple years, and who I've only met once. I told her to bring everyone. The civil case is ongoing. Faye says it will likely settle rather than go to trial, but that the terms will be meaningful. The criminal inquiry is moving more slowly, as those things do, but it's moving. The branch manager, the one who turned the monitor toward me that Thursday morning, his name was Todd. I went back to that branch a month later and asked to speak with him. I shook his hand and I thanked him. I didn't know what else to say, and it probably wasn't enough. He said he'd seen it before, more times than he wished. He said he was glad I'd listened. I think about the version of that day where I just took my $400 and left, where nobody flagged it, where I went home and called the gutter guy, and the season turned, and Owen kept going, and I never looked closely enough to notice what was in front of me the whole time. I don't let myself sit in that version too long. It isn't useful, but I understand it now, how it happens, how someone can take and take from someone who trusts them, slowly enough that the absence looks like ordinary life. My wife spent 27 years teaching kids to read. She kept every card her students ever gave her in a box in the closet. I still have the box. I'm not going to touch it for a while yet, but I know it's there, and someday I'll open it, and it will be okay. She worked too hard for what we had. We both did. I'm not letting it go without a fight, and Renata, she never stopped paying attention. She just needed me to finally start listening. I should have listened a long time ago. I know that now. And every morning when the coffee's still hot and the house is quiet, I sit with that. Not with guilt anymore, mostly. Just with the kind of clarity you earn when you finally stop looking the wrong direction. Some debts don't get repaid in money, but some of them still get settled.